The signal came from the edge of the Orion arm, quiet and small, like a whisper between stars. Ambassador Vreth of the Kelhari people was the first to receive it aboard the Galactic Council's listening station. He stared at his console for a long moment, his three amber eyes blinking in slow, careful rhythm. The signal was structured. It followed mathematical patterns. And it was coming from a planet that, according to every council record in existence, was supposed to be completely uninhabited. He ran the scan again, then a third time. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants. The council knew it by its catalog number, Sector 7, Arm 3, World 4G. It had been flagged roughly 400 years ago during a routine survey mission. The survey team had noted simple life forms, early tribal structures, primitive stone tools, and zero technological development of any significance. The report had been filed, stamped, and forgotten at the bottom of a database that nobody ever opened. Earth was not interesting. Earth was background noise. Vreth forwarded the signal to High Counselor Sareth immediately. Sareth was a Delvani, one of the oldest species in the known galaxy, with a memory that stretched back 900 years of personal experience and access to thousands of years of recorded history. She received Vreth's message while sitting in the grand circular chamber of the Council's home station orbiting the star Velran Prime. She read the attached data once. She read it again. Then she stood up slowly and walked to the window that looked out into open space, placing one of her 6 long fingers against the cold glass. "This cannot be right," she said to no one. But it was right. Every instrument confirmed it. The planet Earth, logged as a pre-technological world only 4 centuries ago, was now producing faster-than-light communications. Not just producing them, broadcasting them openly, casually, the way a civilization broadcasts when it has been doing something for a very long time and sees no reason to hide. Sareth called an emergency session of the full Galactic Council within the hour. The chamber filled quickly. Representatives from 43 recognized species took their seats around the great ring table, their translator chips humming softly. There were the Kelhari, insect-like and precise. The massive stone-boned Grund, who had to sit in reinforced chairs. The delicate, glass-skinned Felorians, who communicated partly through bioluminescent flashes across their bodies. Every species present had gone through centuries, sometimes millennia, of slow, steady development to reach the stars. The Council's records of each member species' growth were thorough, detailed, and proud. Sareth brought up the Earth file on the central display. The room went very quiet. Counselor Maff of the Grund spoke first, his voice like grinding boulders. 400 years. That is the gap between their stone tools and faster-than-light communication. He paused. That is not development. That is detonation. Nobody laughed, because nobody thought it was funny. The average time for a species to move from early tool use to basic interplanetary travel was approximately 12,000 years. The Delvani had taken 9,000, and they were considered remarkably fast. The Felorians had taken over 20,000, which was considered perfectly normal. Even the fastest species on record, the now extinct Threx, had taken 6,000 years to reach orbit from their first fires. Humanity had apparently done something in 400 years that should have taken at minimum 3,000. "There must be an error in the original survey," said Representative Luno of the Felorians, her skin flickering pale blue with unease. Perhaps the survey team misclassified the planet's development stage. Perhaps they were already more advanced than the report suggested. Sareth pulled up the original survey footage. It played on the central display. Real footage, not reconstructed, not estimated. Actual recordings from 4 centuries ago. Humans in rough clothing, carrying hand-carved tools, building shelters out of wood and stone. A small group of them standing around a fire, looking up at the sky with wide, curious eyes as the survey ship passed overhead in stealth mode. They had not even known they were being watched. The chamber was completely silent for a long moment. "That is them," Sareth said quietly. 400 years ago. She switched the display to the current signal intercepts. Streams of complex data, engineering schematics, what appeared to be casual entertainment broadcasts, trading communications, scientific journals, all of it flowing freely into space with the easy confidence of a civilization that had been doing this for generations. Counselor Vreth, who had joined the session remotely, spoke carefully. "We should send a reconnaissance vessel. Observe before we make contact. We do not yet understand what we are dealing with. That proposal passed unanimously and immediately, which was itself unusual. The Galactic Council rarely agreed on anything quickly. The fact that every single representative voted yes, without argument, said something important about the mood in that room. Something that sat closer to fear than curiosity. The reconnaissance vessel chosen was a Felorian stealth craft, the best sensor-masking technology in the known galaxy. It carried a crew of 12 from 6 different species, all scientists, all carefully selected. Their mission was simple: approach Earth, observe, record, and return. Do not be seen. Do not make contact. Just watch. They arrived at Earth's outer solar system within 2 weeks. The lead scientist aboard was a Kelhari named Tessiv, who had spent 200 years studying developing civilizations. She had watched dozens of species take their first steps into space. She knew what early spacefaring looked like: the cautious probes, the slow orbital stations, the nervous, incremental expansion. What she saw outside Earth did not look like any of that. The humans had built something they called a solar defense grid, which Tessiv's instruments identified almost immediately. It was not aggressive in design. It was clearly intended for protection, but the scale of it was extraordinary. Automated platforms orbited at multiple distances from the planet, linked in a network so tightly integrated that Tessiv's systems needed several hours just to map it properly. There were mining operations on multiple moons in the system. There were what appeared to be habitation structures on the surface of their neighboring red planet. There were ships, dozens of them, moving between these locations with practiced efficiency. Tessiv sent her first report back to the Council with steady hands, but she had to stop typing twice to simply look out the viewport and process what she was seeing. Then something happened that she had not expected at all. One of the human ships changed course. It was a mid-sized vessel, nothing remarkable by its appearance, moving on what had seemed like a routine path between 2 of the outer planets. But it changed course smoothly, without hesitation, and began moving directly toward the Felorian stealth craft. Not rushing, not alarming, just heading toward them with the calm confidence of something that already knew exactly where they were. Tessiv checked the stealth systems, all functioning perfectly. Every sensor mask was active. By every known law of detection technology, they should have been completely invisible. The human ship came to a stop exactly 300 kilometers away and held position there. Then a communication opened on a frequency the crew had not broadcast on. A frequency they had only used internally, between crew members, inside the ship. A voice came through. Human, female, speaking in a language that Tessiv's translator chip needed almost 4 full seconds to process. Not because the language was complex, but because the chip had never encountered it and had to build its translation model from scratch in real time. When the translation came through, the message was short. We see you. We have seen you since you entered the system. We are not alarmed. We would like to talk, if you are comfortable. No pressure. Take your time. Tessiv stared at the communication panel for a very long time. Then she sent a second message back to the Council. This one was much shorter than the first. It said only, "They found us. They are being friendly about it. I do not think we are the ones running this observation anymore." Back on Velran Prime, when Sareth read that message, she sat down very slowly in her chair and looked out at the stars for a long time without speaking. Because somewhere in the back of her 900-year-old mind, a thought was forming that she did not yet want to say out loud. These humans had not just grown fast. They had grown in a direction the Council had never seen before, and they had done it quietly, without asking permission, without announcing themselves, and without making a single mistake that any of the 43 recognized species had ever caught. That was not lucky. That was not accidental. That was something else entirely. The Council's emergency meeting lasted 11 hours without a break. By the end of it, the representatives were exhausted, their translators were overheating from constant use, and nobody had reached any firm conclusion except one. They needed more information before they could decide anything. That was a very typical Galactic Council outcome. What was not typical was the level of anxiety that filled every corridor of the station after the session ended. Species that had lived alongside each other for centuries, sharing trade routes and diplomatic pleasantries and the comfortable rhythms of a galaxy they believed they understood, were suddenly asking questions they had never needed to ask before. Questions like, How closely had they actually been watching the other planets? How many other catalog entries were sitting forgotten at the bottom of old databases? And perhaps most pressingly, if the humans had grown this fast without anyone noticing, what exactly had they been doing during those 400 years? Sareth authorized full contact. There was debate about this. Counselor Maff argued for continued observation. Representative Luno wanted to consult with the full scientific community first. Several smaller representatives suggested waiting until a proper risk assessment could be completed. Sareth listened to all of them carefully, and then she authorized full contact anyway, because the humans had already opened a channel and were politely waiting, and she felt that keeping them waiting any longer would be both rude and strategically unwise. She chose the contact team personally. 3 diplomats, 2 xenobiologists, 1 linguist, and herself. They traveled aboard the Council's most respected diplomatic vessel, not the largest or the most armed, but the one with the finest reputation, the one that had facilitated peace agreements between species who had been at war for 3 generations. She wanted the humans to understand, from the first moment, that the Council came in the spirit of dialogue. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system and were immediately, courteously, hailed. The human voice on the channel was different from the one Tessiv had heard. Male this time, unhurried, with a warmth that none of the Council team had quite expected. Welcome to the Sol system. We've been hoping someone would visit. If you'll follow the beacon, we've prepared a meeting point at the 3rd station. Comfortable environment for multiple atmospheric types. We did some research on what your people typically need. Let us know if we got anything wrong. Sareth's linguist looked at her with wide eyes. She gave him a small nod that meant, yes, I noticed that too. The humans had prepared. They had done research. They had built an environment suited to alien visitors before the first official contact had even taken place. They followed the beacon. The station that came into view was not what any of them expected. It was large, well-constructed, and clearly functional, but what struck Sareth first was how lived-in it looked. There were observation windows everywhere, and through several of them, she could see humans going about what appeared to be ordinary work, moving equipment, talking to each other, eating. Children were visible in one section, doing what appeared to be schoolwork near a large transparent panel that looked directly out into space. They bring children to space stations. The xenobiologist sitting beside Sareth murmured quietly. They bring children, Sareth agreed, and she filed that detail away carefully. The docking process was smooth. On the other side of the airlock, 5 humans waited for them. They were dressed practically, not ceremonially, which was itself a message. This was not a performance. A woman in the center stepped forward. She introduced herself as Director Yael Okafor of the Human Diplomatic Service, and she shook Sareth's hand, a human gesture that Sareth had been briefed on, though actually experiencing the warmth and firmness of a human hand was different from reading about it. We're glad you came, Okafor said simply. We've had a lot of questions about the galaxy, and we figured at some point someone would come knocking. They moved to a large meeting room. The atmospheric settings were, as promised, precisely calibrated for each of the Council members' needs. Sareth noted that the humans in the room were breathing the same recycled station air they always did, which meant they had adjusted the environment entirely for their guests' comfort and made no mention of it. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours on the first day. It was, from the Council's perspective, one of the strangest diplomatic exchanges any of them had ever experienced. Not because the humans were hostile or evasive or difficult. Quite the opposite. The humans were extraordinarily open. They answered every question directly, without the careful hedging and strategic omission that defined almost every first-contact diplomatic exchange in galactic history. When asked how they had developed so quickly, Okafor smiled and said, "We had a lot of problems. Turns out solving problems fast is something we're reasonably good at." When asked whether they had weaponized their technology, a human scientist in the room named Dr. Chen pulled up a full schematic of their defense grid and walked the Council's xenobiologist through it in patient detail, explaining every system, every function, every limitation. He answered follow-up questions for 2 hours without once suggesting that any of it was classified. When Counselor Vreth, attending remotely, asked carefully whether humanity had any interest in territorial expansion, Okafor leaned back in her chair and thought about it for a moment. Genuinely thought, not performed consideration. and then said, "We're interested in the universe. We're not particularly interested in owning it." That night, back aboard the council vessel, Saratha's team sat together and processed everything they had learned. The two xenobiologists were filling documents with observations. The linguist was working through recordings of the day's conversations, cataloging patterns in human communication. The diplomats were very quiet. One of the diplomats, a Kelhari named Sorav who had 30 years of experience, spoke eventually. "They are not performing honesty," he said. "I have sat across from species that were being strategically transparent, and I know what that looks like. These humans are simply honest. It is not a tactic. It is their default." "That is either very admirable," said the second diplomat, a Felorian, her skin flickering in uncertain colors, "or very dangerous. I cannot decide which." "Perhaps both," Sorav said. What truly unsettled the council, and what took longer to surface because it required comparing many small observations rather than one large one, was the picture that emerged of what humanity had actually done during those 400 years. It was not just technological development. It was something more integrated and stranger than that. The humans had fought each other, badly and often, in conflicts that had cost tens of millions of lives. And then, somewhere in the middle of all of that, they had begun solving those conflicts. Not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. They had built systems of governance that could hold wildly different groups together. They had developed an economic framework that could carry a planetary civilization into space. They had created art, medicine, philosophy, and engineering in parallel, feeding each discipline into the others in a cycle that accelerated everything. And they had done all of this while arguing constantly, loudly, publicly, with great passion and no apparent shame. "They fight about everything," the xenobiologist told Sarath, "and then they keep going anyway. It seems to accelerate rather than halt their progress." Sarah thought about that for a long time. On the second day of talks, she asked Okafor a direct question. "Your species has experienced significant internal conflict. How did you prevent that conflict from destroying your civilization before you reached this point?" Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Sarath would think about for years afterward. "We didn't prevent it. We just made sure the people who wanted to fix things always had slightly more energy than the people who wanted to break them. It was close, sometimes. Very close." She said it without drama, without pride, with the flat and simple honesty of someone describing weather. Sarath returned to her vessel that evening and sat alone in her cabin for a long time. 900 years of memory, and she had never encountered a species quite like this. A species that had nearly destroyed itself repeatedly, that argued and struggled and failed in spectacular ways, and that had somehow turned all of that chaos into the fastest recorded civilizational development in galactic history. She opened her communication line to the full council and began her report. "The humans," she said carefully, "are not what our original survey suggested. They are also not what our fears suggested during the emergency session. They are something we do not have a category for yet." She paused. "I recommend we create one." Back on Earth Station, Director Okafor sat in her own office after the council team returned to their ship, looking out at the stars through the same panel the schoolchildren used. One of her aides came in and asked how she thought the first day had gone. Okafor considered. "They're scared of us," she said. "Which makes sense. We probably should have introduced ourselves sooner." She thought for another moment. "But they're trying. That's all you can ask." She turned back to the window. Outside, the galaxy waited. 43 recognized species. A council that had governed the known stars for longer than humanity had been writing things down, and a whole architecture of alliances and histories and careful balances that had never had to account for the existence of Earth. That architecture was about to get significantly more complicated. And somewhere deep in the Council's archives, in a file that had not been opened for 400 years, the original survey report on World 4G sat, with its final line still visible in the database. No significant development expected. Low priority. No further monitoring required. Someone, eventually, would have to update that file. The invitation arrived 6 weeks after first contact, delivered through the new communication link that the Council and humanity had established together in what was, by any measure, a remarkably short time. It was addressed to the full Galactic Council and signed by something called the United Earth Assembly, which, as the Council's researchers had come to understand, was the closest thing humanity had to a singular governing body, though even that description required many footnotes, because human governance was layered and complicated in ways that required multiple briefing documents just to begin explaining. The invitation was simple. Humanity wanted to host a delegation of council representatives on Earth itself, not on a station, not at a neutral point in space, on Earth. They wanted the council to see where they came from. This proposal generated the longest internal council debate since the Grundfalorian border crisis of 3 centuries ago. The concerns were varied. Some representatives worried about security, not for themselves, but for Earth. Bringing 43 species worth of biology and technology to a populated planet was complex. Others worried about the message it would send to the broader galaxy, that the Council was moving too fast, endorsing humanity before proper evaluation was complete. Councillor Maff, the great Grund, argued that the speed of the entire relationship was irresponsible. "We have known them for 6 weeks," he said in the chamber. "We do not invite species to receive council delegations after 6 weeks. We have never had a species reach out to us in this way before," Sareth replied. "Perhaps we need different rules." She won the debate. Not easily, but she won it. The delegation that traveled to Earth was smaller than originally proposed. 12 representatives, including Sareth herself, traveling aboard a single vessel with a minimal support crew. They approached Earth from the daylight side, and Sareth watched the planet come into focus through the viewport with the careful attention of someone who knows they are witnessing something they will not forget. It was blue and white mostly, green at the edges, where the clouds broke, smaller than several inhabited worlds she had visited. It looked, to her eyes, quiet. It was not quiet. The moment they entered orbit, human traffic control, a system that apparently handled thousands of orbital movements per day, smoothly incorporated their vessel into the flow as if alien diplomatic ships arrived routinely. A human pilot's voice came through the channel with calm instructions. Checked twice that the atmospheric entry profile was comfortable for all aboard, and guided them down without incident. They landed in a place called Kenya. Director Okafor was there to meet them, alongside a group of humans who represented, she explained, the full range of Earth's governing regions. They were different from each other in ways the council members found immediately striking. Different in appearance, in manner, in the languages they originally spoke before translation. And yet they stood together without any visible tension, presenting a unified welcome with the ease of people who had worked out their differences before anyone arrived. The first thing Sareth noticed about Earth was the sky. She had been to many worlds, but something about Earth's particular quality of light, the way it scattered through a specific thickness of atmosphere to produce a color that fell somewhere between deep water and fading fire, was unusual. Several members of the delegation stopped walking simply to look up. The humans noticed this and said nothing. They waited. That became a pattern. Throughout the 3 days the delegation spent on Earth, the humans were extraordinarily good at waiting. They did not fill silences with nervous explanation. They did not push the council members toward the next scheduled activity when the current one was still being absorbed. They seemed to understand, without being told, that experiencing something new takes time, and they gave that time freely. What the council saw over those 3 days rearranged certain assumptions that had been sitting untouched for centuries. On the first day, they visited a city. It was enormous, chaotic, loud in ways that tested some of the delegation's sensory tolerance, and packed with a density of human life that was initially overwhelming. But within that chaos, there was a structure, not the imposed structure of a controlled civilization, but an organic structure, the kind that emerges when millions of individual decisions accumulate into something that somehow functions. Sareth watched humans navigate the city and was struck by how independently each of them moved, and yet how rarely they collided. Physically, socially, logistically. They negotiated space with each other constantly, thousands of small adjustments per hour, and they did it without any apparent central coordination. How do they not collapse into complete disorder? The Kelhari representative murmured beside her. "I do not know," Sareth said honestly. "I have been trying to determine that." On the second day, they visited a research complex. This was the day that genuinely shook several members of the delegation. Not because of any single discovery or technology, but because of the breadth of what humanity was working on simultaneously. The complex housed researchers working in fields that, in most council species, would have been considered separate and unrelated: medicine, material science, atmospheric engineering, deep space propulsion, historical preservation, marine biology, artificial intelligence, and, in one room that stopped the delegation completely, an ongoing project to catalog and protect the genetic information of every living species on Earth. Everyone, the council's xenobiologist asked the human researcher leading the tour. All of them. All of them that we've found so far, the researcher said. We're at about 91% complete. It's slow work. The xenobiologist, who had been professionally calm for the entire trip, sat down on the nearest bench and was quiet for a full minute. Then she said, to no one in particular, they are preserving life they have never spoken to. Life that cannot communicate with them. They are doing it anyway. The human researcher looked at her with a small, understanding nod. Seemed like the right thing to do, she said simply. The third day was the one that Sarith would later describe, in her formal report to the council, as the day she finally understood what she was looking at. They were brought to a place called a memorial, one of many, the humans explained, that existed across Earth in different forms. This particular one was dedicated to people who had died in a conflict that had occurred roughly a century before the current time. There were names on the walls, thousands of names, and the humans who walked through it did so quietly, with a particular kind of weight that Sarith recognized across every species she had ever met, the weight of genuine grief, carried forward in time by collective memory. Afterward, Director Okafor walked beside Sarith through a garden adjoining the memorial. The two of them were briefly separated from the rest of the group. You keep them, Sarith said. The names of those who were lost. We keep them, Okafor agreed. All of them, as far back as we can. The ones who made mistakes, the ones who were wronged, the ones who fixed things, the ones who broke things. We keep all of it. Sarith considered this. Most species, when they reach your stage, prefer to present their best history to new civilizations. Okafor shrugged slightly. We thought about that, but it seemed dishonest. And also, honestly, we think our mistakes are part of why we are the way we are. We're not ashamed of having made them. We're just determined not to repeat them. You have repeated some of them, Sarith pointed out carefully. Yes, Okafor said without hesitation. And we keep that in the records too. That evening, on the last night before the delegation departed, the humans hosted a dinner, a human tradition, apparently, of sharing food as a social and diplomatic gesture. The food itself was extraordinary in its variety, which the humans seemed quietly proud of. Members of the delegation who could safely consume human food were encouraged to try whatever interested them, and the conversation around the table was the most relaxed that Sarith had experienced since arriving. At one point, late in the evening, Counselor Vreth asked Okafor a question that the rest of the table went quiet to hear. What do you want from the council? What is it that humanity actually hopes to gain from this relationship? Okafor set down the cup she was holding and thought about it. Around the table, dozens of humans and 11 alien diplomats waited. We want to understand the universe, she said finally. All of it. What's out there, how it works, why it is the way it is. We've been working on that question for as long as we've been human, and we've barely started. She paused. Also, honestly, we'd like neighbors. It gets a little quiet out here. The laughter that followed was spontaneous and crossed several species. Not all of them, but enough. And in that moment, in a room on a planet that the council had written off as irrelevant 4 centuries ago, Sarith felt something shift. Not just in the room, but in her own understanding of what this relationship was going to become. The humans were not asking to be admitted to the council as junior members, as most new species did. They were not positioning themselves as a threat, as several of the more anxious council members had feared. They were doing something that Sarith could not immediately name, but could feel the shape of. They were extending an invitation of their own, one that had no political conditions attached to it, one that came from a species that had decided, somewhere along the way, that curiosity was more useful than caution. The delegation left Earth the next morning. The humans came to see them off in numbers that were not required and not expected. They stood at the edge of the landing area and watched the ship rise, and several of them waved. A small, simple gesture that required no translation at all. Sarith watched them grow small through the viewport as the ship climbed, and she made a decision. When she returned to Velran Prime, she was going to propose something that the council had never done before. She was going to propose that humanity not be evaluated as a new member candidate in the usual process. The lengthy observation period, the graduated access, the slow and careful integration that had been the Council's standard procedure for as long as the Council had existed. She was going to propose something entirely different. And she suspected it was going to cause an argument unlike anything the Council chamber had heard in a very long time. Saratha's proposal reached the Council chamber before she did. She had transmitted it from the ship during the return journey, knowing that 43 species worth of representatives would need time to read it, react to it, and argue about it before she arrived. She wanted the first wave of objections to be done with by the time she stood in the chamber herself. She was 900 years old, and she had learned a long time ago that good proposals needed to be controversial before they could become consensus. The proposal was this: humanity should be offered full partnership in the Galactic Council, not membership, not candidacy, not probationary status. Full partnership, with the same standing as any of the 43 recognized species, effective upon their agreement. The arguments against it arrived faster than communications across the light years usually permitted. Councillor Maff transmitted his objection within the first hour. He called the proposal dangerous, unprecedented, and structurally irresponsible. His exact words, as they came through the translation filter, were, "We do not know these people. 400 years ago they were carrying sticks. We cannot hand them the governance of the galaxy because they made an interesting impression during a 3-day visit." Others followed. Several smaller species, those whose membership in the Council was itself relatively recent, worried about what it would mean for their own standing if a civilization could leap directly to full partnership in a matter of months. The Felorians, ordinarily among the more open-minded Council members, submitted a formal request for a delay and a full psychological evaluation of humanity's decision-making frameworks. This was not an insult, merely a standard procedure they applied to all new candidates, but applying it now, after the proposal, felt like a statement. And the Grund, all 7 of their representatives, filed a collective written response that was 12,000 words long and cited 300 years of Council procedural precedent, every single line of which could be summarized as, "This is not how things are done." Sarath read all of it on the journey back. She filed every objection carefully in her memory, built her responses methodically, and arrived at Velran Prime ready. The session that followed lasted 3 days. It was, by universal agreement among those who were present, the most intense Council session in living memory, which, given that several Council members had living memories stretching back over 1,000 years, was a significant statement. At various points the translation system struggled to keep pace with the simultaneous arguments crossing the chamber. At one point Councillor Maff and Representative Luno were speaking at the same time for 6 straight minutes, each convinced the other was pausing. Sarath let them argue. She stood at the speaker's position and let the debate go where it needed to go, and when it finally slowed, when everyone had said their loudest thing and the room began to breathe again, she spoke. She spoke for 4 hours. She addressed every objection by name, every procedural concern with specific counterprecedent, every fear with evidence she had gathered on Earth. She talked about the Genetic Preservation Project and what it said about how humanity valued life they would never directly benefit from protecting. She talked about the memorial and what it meant that a species maintained full, honest records of its own worst moments. She talked about the city and the uncoordinated coordination of millions of people who had built systems of coexistence through accumulated small decisions rather than centralized control. She talked about the research complex and the 47 simultaneous fields of study that fed each other in a cycle the Council had no existing model to describe. And then she said the thing she had been building toward from the beginning. Every species in this chamber, she said, her voice carrying the particular quality that came from 900 years of knowing how to hold a room, achieved its place here through the standard process. Long observation, slow integration, careful evaluation over generations. And that process has served us well. I am not dismissing it. She paused. But that process assumes we understand what we are evaluating. It assumes the developing civilization fits a pattern we recognize. It assumes we are the more advanced party conducting the assessment. The chamber was very quiet. I am not certain that assumption holds with humanity, she said. And I think we need to be honest about that. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. 8 of the 43 species voted against. 17 abstained, citing the need for more time. 18 voted yes. 18 was enough for passage under council rules, because the rules required a simple majority of active votes, not abstentions, and Sareth had known that going in. She had counted carefully before she ever stood at the speaker's position. The formal offer of partnership was transmitted to Earth the following morning. Director Okafor received it in her office at the United Earth Assembly's headquarters. She read it twice, then called her senior staff. They spent 6 hours in discussion, during which, by several accounts, there was a significant amount of argument. Not panic, argument. Humans apparently processed transformative news by immediately debating the implications with each other, loudly and from multiple angles, until something resembling a shared understanding emerged from the noise. At the end of those 6 hours, Okafor sent a reply that was, given the magnitude of what was being offered, remarkably brief. We accept. We have a lot of questions. We're told that's normal for us. We look forward to working together. The formal partnership ceremony took place aboard the council's main station, in the same circular chamber where Sareth had first received Vretha's strange signal and called the emergency session that started everything. The chamber looked the same as it always had, the great ring table, the seats arranged by species, the viewport showing open space. But something was different about it now, and everyone present felt it, even if no one said it directly. Humanity's designated seat at the table was positioned between the Kelhari and the Delvani by Sareth's specific arrangement. She had thought carefully about symbolism. The Kelhari were precise, methodical, and data-driven. The Delvani, her own people, were long memory keepers, historians, the species most responsible for maintaining the Council's institutional knowledge. She placed humanity between memory and precision, because that seemed, to her, like an accurate description of where they belonged. Okafor arrived with a delegation of 7, smaller than protocol suggested, which was itself a statement of confidence. They walked into the chamber without ceremony, found their seats, and sat down with the comfortable ease of people who had decided before arriving that they were not going to be intimidated by the room. Councillor Maff, to his considerable credit, was the first to formally speak to the human delegation after the partnership documents were signed. He rose to his full height, which, for a Grund, was considerable, and looked across the table at Okafor for a long moment. Then he said, in his grinding bolder voice, "I voted against this arrangement. I want you to know that." Okafor met his eyes steadily. "I know. I read the session transcripts." Mav paused. "You read the full transcripts?" "All 3 days. Our team found them very informative." She held his gaze. "I appreciate that you said it directly rather than pretending it didn't happen. That's something I can work with." The silence that followed was unusual. For Councillor Maff, who had argued against this exact moment, it was the silence of a very old and stubborn being confronted with a thing he had not expected. A new ally who was already, from the first exchange, more interesting than an opponent. He sat down without another word. But the posture was different. Slightly less closed. Sareth noticed. She noticed everything. In the weeks and months that followed, the pattern that emerged was not what anyone on the council had predicted. Not the optimists and not the pessimists. The humans did not arrive quietly, learn the rules, and slowly integrate themselves into the existing council culture. They also did not arrive loudly, challenge everything, and destabilize the architecture of galactic governance. They did something that no one had prepared a model for. They participated. Fully, immediately, energetically, from the very first session. They brought proposals. They asked questions, many questions, some of them embarrassingly basic, some of them startlingly sharp. They formed working relationships with other species at a pace that the Council's behavioral scientists found genuinely unprecedented. Not because humans were performing sociability, but because they seemed to find other people, any people, of any shape or biology or cultural framework, genuinely interesting. They also disagreed. Openly, reasonably, without grudge. When humanity's position on a resource allocation proposal conflicted with the Kelhari position, the human representative sat down with the Kelhari representative for 4 hours, worked through every point of contention, and emerged with a modified proposal that both could support. The Kelhari representative afterward described the experience as exhausting, occasionally frustrating, and ultimately more productive than any similar process I have participated in during my 40-year council career. The thing that changed the council most, slowly and permanently, was harder to name than any single event. It was a shift in atmosphere, a change in what felt possible. The council had been, for centuries, a body defined primarily by caution, not because its members were cowardly, but because the galaxy was complex and the stakes of getting things wrong were enormous, and caution was the tool that had kept the peace. Humanity brought something else alongside caution. They brought the instinct that problems were meant to be solved, that the function of a governing body was not to manage situations carefully to a standstill, but to actually fix things, that stagnation was not safety, but merely a different kind of failure. They said this in meetings, quietly and persistently, and the effect on the council was not revolution, but, more powerfully, more durably, inspiration. 3 years after the partnership ceremony, Sareth sat in the chamber during a regular session and watched Director Okafor walk 2 ancient rival species through a framework for shared resource management that had been proposed, drafted, revised, and agreed upon in 11 weeks, a process that had failed and been abandoned 6 separate times in the previous century. She watched it happen and felt something she had not felt in her very long life with any frequency: surprise. She was 900 years old. She had seen most things. She had thought, without arrogance, but with simple statistical confidence, that very few developments in the galaxy would genuinely surprise her anymore. She had been wrong about that, and she realized, grateful. After the session, she walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars the way she had on the day this all began, when a signal had arrived from a planet that should not have been able to send one. The galaxy looked the same. The stars were in the same positions. The vastness was unchanged, but something in it had shifted. Some invisible weight had moved. The Council had existed for millennia as the careful, steady keeper of a galaxy that was complex and old and set in its ways. It was still all of those things, but it had a new partner now, young, loud, curious, occasionally baffling, and possessed of a quality that Sareth had spent 3 years trying to find the right word for and had finally settled on. The word was alive. Not more alive than other species. All species were alive, but alive in a particular way, a way that treated every limitation as a starting point and every problem as an invitation, a way that had been forged in centuries of fire and argument and survival and had come out the other side not hardened into rigidity, but somehow still open, still reaching, still looking at the stars and asking what comes next. The galaxy, Sareth thought, would not be the same. She was not sure, looking out at those ancient lights, whether that was something to be cautious about or grateful for. She decided, after a long moment, that it was probably both. And that was, she thought, a very human answer to arrive at.